So thank you, Emanuele, for that really kind introduction. And before I start, I'd like to add my thanks to everyone else's, to you, for setting up this seminar series and inviting me to contribute. I'm sure it's going to become a very important forum for the history of philosophy, and I look forward to hearing lots of other talks at VAMP in future. I'd also like to thank you all for being here. I'm sorry, of course, that I can't see you face to face, but I guess screen to screen is not so bad. About the talk, just let me say that there will be very occasional slides, but that mainly I'm just going to talk. I'll talk for about half an hour, maybe a tiny bit more, and then very much look forward to hearing your questions and comments and criticisms. So, as you know, early modern philosophers were keen to understand what distinguishes different kinds of living things, and specifically, what distinguishes one animal species from another. It was easy enough, of course, to observe some of the distinctive features of particular kinds of animals, and people had been doing that for thousands of years, but giving a systematic account of them was more difficult. One range of questions that confronted philosophers and scientists concerned the nature of the boundary between one species and another. First, was it possible, as some investigators believed, for an individual of one kind to metamorphose into an individual of another kind, so that in at least some cases, the species boundary was permeable? Secondly, was it possible for an animal of one kind to produce offspring of another kind, so that the species boundary could be breached in the process of reproduction? And then at the same time, there was the problem of what the members of a given species have in common, and which characteristics best capture a species' nature. What are the distinguishing features of lions, for example? Do they include the fact that lions give birth to lions? Do they include other bodily features? And if so, well, which ones? So today, drawing on the paper I've circulated, I'd like to examine Spinoza's answers to these questions. I'll begin by discussing his answer to the first question, is there such a thing as animal metamorphosis? And that'll allow me to highlight some features of his ontology that it'll be useful as we go along. I'll then propose that in the Ethics, Spinoza answers the second and third questions by offering a distinctive general account of the features that unite individuals into a species. This account, I'll suggest, is shaped by the overall project of the Ethics, which I take to be the project of showing what we humans need to know in order to live as powerfully and joyfully as we can. Guided by that aspiration, I'll suggest, Spinoza defends the rather unusual view that species are best distinguished by their capacity to respond to one another's affects. Instead of following the trend set out by his contemporaries and defining species in biological terms, he argues that the members of a species are united by their mutual sociability. And finally, I'll suggest that that view is supported by a complementary argument that Spinoza develops in his two political works. So that's the plan. So starting then with the first question, can a living thing of one kind metamorphose into a living thing of a different kind? Some of Spinoza's contemporaries argued in favor of metamorphosis. When caterpillars become butterflies, they thought one kind of living thing becomes another. When flies are generated out of moldy cheese, something similar applies. Spinoza strongly disagrees with them, though his examples of metamorphosis are drawn from Ovidian fantasy rather than from the science of his day. The less men know nature, he says, the more they can feign that men are changed in a moment into stones or springs, and even gods are changed into beasts and into men, and many other things of this kind. So a belief in metamorphosis, Spinoza is saying, rests on an ignorance of nature. But Spinoza's argument against metamorphosis is rooted in his metaphysical conception of individual things. According to the ethics, you remember, each individual strives to persevere in its being. And this striving, or conatus, is nothing but the actual essence of the thing, Spinoza tells us. The essence or nature of an individual lion, for example, is to persevere in its being or maintain itself in existence as the thing it is. The problem with people who imagine that metamorphosis occurs in nature, Spinoza thinks, is that they fail to grasp the implications of these truths. To acquire a different nature, as metamorphosis demands, an individual would have to negate its own essence or stop persevering in its being. It would have to stop being the thing it is. In other words, it would have to bring it about that it ceases to exist. But this it cannot do. Spinoza is emphatic that, as he puts it, no thing has anything in itself by which it can be destroyed or which takes its existence away. So an individual can change, a thing can pass to a greater or lesser level of perfection or power without changing its form. But if it undergoes a change in form or nature, it's destroyed, regardless of what form it acquires. In Spinoza's words, a horse is destroyed as much if it's changed into a man as if it's changed into an insect. So, either a thing maintains its nature while increasing or decreasing in power, or it undergoes such radical change that its nature is destroyed, and that leaves no room for metamorphosis. According to this account, the nature or the essence of a thing sets limits to what it can become. It's impossible, for instance, for a horse to become a man. When Spinoza describes these limits in physical terms, he characterizes them as the limits of a proportion or ratio of motion and rest. A body, he tells us, is constituted by the ratio of motion and rest among its parts and continues to exist as long as this proportion is maintained. But once it loses this proportion, it's destroyed. Or as Spinoza puts it more dramatically in the short treatise, that is death. So Spinoza intends this model to explain, as he puts it, how a composite individual can be affected in many ways and still preserve its nature. By positing a proportion of motion and rest that remains more or less stable throughout an individual's existence, the model explains what it is for an individual to endure. But precisely because the proportion of motion and rest doesn't change, the model is less forthcoming about the changes that do occur in the individual all along the way. By representing all these internal changes as fluctuations or oscillations within a ratio of motion and rest that remains basically the same, the account seems to obscure the difference between, say, the vast transformation of power that occurs in the passage from human infancy to maturity, and the temporary dip in power that you get when you have a common cold. Both are simply fluctuations in an individual's proportion of motion and rest. But while it's relatively easy to construe a cold in these terms, the model seems to me less helpful as an account of the baby's passage to adulthood. By hypothesis, the baby's proportion of motion and rest doesn't alter as it grows up, but its power to persevere in its being nevertheless undergoes radical change. So how does its conatus both enable and limit this pattern of development? In Spinoza's view, changes in an individual's power to persevere in its being are often the effects of its interactions with external things. In some cases, an individual's interactions enable it to maintain powers that it's already exercising. But interactions can also transform the way individuals persevere in their being by altering their repertoire of responses to the situations in which they find themselves. For instance, when a child learns to talk as a result of being talked to, she acquires a new range of powers. To do justice to alterations like this, I think it might be helpful to envisage an individual's essence or nature as a structurally complex power that unfolds over the course of its existence. As the child learns to speak, her interactions with other speakers serve as triggers which activate or unfold powers that follow from her nature and give her new ways of persevering in her being. An individual's essence, therefore, incorporates the potential to acquire and exercise new powers, which in turn create the conditions for acquiring and exercising yet further powers, and so on. Although the essence of an individual endures until it's destroyed, the way this essence unfolds as the individual interacts with external things, and thus the way the individual becomes able to express its nature or strive to persevere in its being, can involve great changes in its power. And through their interactions, individuals can radically alter one another, each enhancing or diminishing the other's power. At the same time, however, this process has some fixed boundaries. As well as allowing for change, an individual's nature imposes limits on the powers it can acquire or lose. And one of these limits, one of the things that it rules out is metamorphosis. So that's as much as I'll say now about the first question. I'll move on to the second and the third questions on the slide, starting with the third one. So, on what systematic basis should we classify individuals into species? In Spinoza's view, we group individual things into kinds on the basis of our limited and fallible experience. And our ideas of animal species are just instances of these groupings. They reflect what Spinoza calls our imaginative grasp of the world, and they may involve all sorts of misconceptions. But nonetheless, they're not completely fanciful. Spinoza seems to take it for granted that our ideas of lions, dogs, human beings capture enough of their natures to guide our understanding and allow us to theorize the differences between them. When he takes up that task, I now want to propose, he gives two complementary answers to the question of what constitutes a species and what differentiates one species from another. So the first of these accounts rests on the claim that there is more commonality or agreement between the natures of members of a single species than between those of different species. Two lions have more in common than a lion and a tortoise. The notion of commonality to which Spinoza appeals here reiterates, I think, the Cartesian view that two individuals can only interact if they have something in common or if they're in some respect like one another. A particular individual, equipped with a specific nature, will therefore be able to interact more fully with some things than with others, and will be particularly well placed to interact with things that have most in common with it. That's the general claim. But what sort of commonality is relevant to the identification of a species? To answer that question, many of Spinoza's contemporaries focused on the bodily characteristics of animals. But his account is organized, perhaps more counterintuitively, around the affective commonalities or agreements that enable animals to interact with others of their kind. In the Ethics, Spinoza discusses the role of the affects, the role that they play in determining the way humans strive to persevere in their being. So we're starting here from the human case. As well as experiencing affects such as joy or sadness, human individuals respond to the affects of individuals like themselves, that's to say other people. As well as recognizing other people's joys and sadnesses, they respond to them with joys and sadnesses of their own. As Spinoza puts it, from the fact that we imagine a thing like us to be affected with an affect, we are affected with a like affect. This pattern of imitation or mutual responsiveness gives rise to whole sequences of affective exchange and corresponding alterations in the ways we strive to persevere in our being. Our pity for other people's sadness, for example, prompts us to relieve their suffering. Our disposition to love and hate what others love and hate can be the basis of solidarity or aggression. Regardless of whether our affective interactions are empowering or disempowering, they're manifestations of our responsiveness to other human beings who are like us in the sense that their repertoire of affective powers is pretty much like our own. These similarities give rise to a range of mutual interactions from which new powers unfold. For example, Spinoza tells us, when we love a thing like ourselves, that's to say another person, we strive as far as we can to bring it about that it loves us in return. In propitious circumstances, our striving for mutual love is the prelude to a sustained amicitia or friendship and initiates the unfolding of new ways of persevering in our being. When friends or lovers empower one another by coordinating their desires, they become more like one another. And as their increased commonality extends their power to interact, it in turn creates conditions for further mutually supportive powers to unfold. Together, they develop ways of persevering in their being that neither could possess alone. Now, so far, Spinoza's been talking about human beings. But he also contrasts the affective agreement between human natures with a lack of affective commonality between humans and other kinds of animals. There's no doubt, he says, that animals are able to feel, but the differences between human and animal natures block affective exchanges between them. To illustrate the point, Spinoza turns to the differences between humans and lions. As he points out, our affective sensitivity to humans sometimes leads us to envy other people their desirable qualities. But we don't envy lions their strength. And the reason for this is that lions don't agree with us in nature, and their affects are different in nature from human affects. Each kind is incapable of entering into the affective world of the other, and this constitutes a species boundary between them. So this, I think, begins to give us a somewhat fuller picture of the powers that simultaneously unite the members of a species and differentiate one species from another. But it may still seem extremely odd that Spinoza should make the possibility of affective exchange so central to his analysis. I'll come back to this point, but I think that part of the explanation derives from a cultural pressure to take a stand on our second question. That's to say, are the members of a species always the progeny of their own kind? More specifically, do members of one species ever violate the species boundary by breeding with members of another? There were lots of advocates of this view in the early modern period, and they often appealed to examples. Locke Locke, for instance, claims to have seen a creature that was the issue of a cat and a rat. But Spinoza now goes on to argue Locke's testimony is highly improbable. And here's his argument, which starts once again from the human case. Spinoza takes it that human love, which, as we've seen, is something that can unfold and enhance your powers, human love encompasses sexual love or lust, a desire and love of joining one body to another, Spinoza says. According to the ethics, for example, a man who experiences sexual envy, I've got this wrong. A man will experience sexual envy when he imagines that a woman he loves prostitutes herself to somebody else. Sexual desire and the relationships in which it's expressed are therefore further manifestations of our power to respond affectively to things like ourselves. By their nature, Spinoza implies, humans are sexually attracted to other humans and strive to satisfy their desires by having sex and reproducing with them. But their sexual desire doesn't extend to other animals, which are in turn attracted to their own kinds. As Spinoza claims here, both the horse and the man are driven by lust to procreate. But the one is driven by equine lust, the other by human lust. So also the lusts and appetites of insects and fish and birds must vary. So one of the limits embodied in an animal's affective nature is that its sexual desire and consequent pattern of reproduction is confined to members of its own kind. Now, before I move on, let me point out that so just to say what I'm saying here is that by emphasizing these affective relationships between different kinds of animals, Spinoza gives himself a way of accommodating his view about whether animals stick within their species through reproduction. That's the first reason I'm offering you as to why Spinoza might lay such emphasis on this question of affective relationship. But before I move on to develop this argument in the last part of my talk, let me just point out that the argument I've reconstructed echoes a commonplace of 17th century Dutch culture. In an immensely popular emblem book, which was compiled by the poet and diplomat Jacob Cats and published in 1618, there's an engraving, you can see it I hope, of a lion lying on a rock next to a giant tortoise or maybe a turtle. Each animal is completely ignoring the other. According to the adage at the top of the page, decidet quod impar est, he disagrees or sets himself apart because he is unequal or unalike. The anecdotes and the poems below the image warn against the dangers of loving people who are in one way or other unlike you. We learn, for example, that a Danish princess who married a commoner bitterly regretted it. But the image suggests that the adage also applies to the members of non-human species, who are shown as indifferent to one another. Spinoza, I've been suggesting, gives this commonplace a philosophical interpretation. To have a human or a leonine nature is to possess the power to enter into community with members of one's own kind and partake in the sociability that constitutes a species. But at the same time, it's to lack the power to enter into community with other kinds of animals. In this crucial respect, one can't cross the species boundary. So coming now to the last part of my talk, I'd like to discuss a complementary juridical version of the argument that I've just set out. And here I'll suggest we begin to get a broader view of Spinoza's reasons for making the affective powers of different types of animals so central to his analysis of species. Spinoza's view that individuals essentially strive to persevere in their being can also be expressed in juridical terms. As his political works claim, when an individual exercises its power to persevere in its being, it also exercises its natural right. Taken one by one, individuals have the natural right to persevere in their being in any way that their nature allows. Or as Spinoza puts it, they have the natural right to do anything in their power. Since, as we've seen, the enduring power that constitutes the nature of a living thing is structurally complex and unfolds as the individual interacts with things around it, the character and extent of an individual's natural right is going to vary with time and place. When a man is consumed by fear, for example, he may exercise his natural right or power by attacking anyone who comes near him. But over time, his affective interactions with other people may unfold his power to live in a more cooperative way with them. In making the transition from aggressive isolation to a relatively harmonious way of life, he continues, of course, to exercise his natural right, but the manner in which he does so changes. The way human beings exercise the right of nature is subject to alteration as their affective responsiveness to one another modifies their relationships. So that's humans, and much the same, I think, applies to non-human animals. To some degree, the members of other species express the similarity of their natures by forming common ways of life, grounded on their responsiveness to one another's affects. But just as Spinoza is adamant that mutual affective responsiveness doesn't extend across species, so he insists that each species exercises its natural right on its own terms. Animals exercise their power or right over humans as their natures dictate. And equally, Spinoza says, humans by nature use animals at their pleasure and treat them as is most convenient. It's striking, I find, that Spinoza doesn't qualify this claim. There's no trace, for example, of Calvin's warning that although God created animals for our use, he requires us to handle them gently. But although Spinoza thinks the right of nature permits us to use animals in any way we can, it doesn't enjoin us to use them badly. For example, if we want to take account of animal natures in order to serve our own interest in maintaining a thriving ecosystem, then we can rightfully do so. What Spinoza rejects is the suggestion that we should try to enter into community with animals by awarding them as much or more consideration than ourselves. To do that, he argues, is to try to become more like these animals and to abdicate the pursuit of our distinctively human powers. We can see this, for instance, from the example of Adam and from the case of religious zealots who choose to live with the lower animals. To take what he says about Adam, after Adam believed that the lower animals to be like himself, he immediately began to imitate their affects and to lose his freedom. If we try to cross the species boundary by entering into affective exchange with non-human animals, then we, like Adam, risk our humanity and become bestial. Spinoza expresses this view, as you know, with surprising vehemence. Attempts to restrict the ways animals are used, he announces, are based more on empty superstition and womanish compassion than on sound reason. As often with Spinoza, I think it's hard to say what drives this sudden outburst of gendered animosity. In the Ethics, Compassion, or misericordia, is defined as the disposition to be glad at somebody else's good fortune or sad at their bad fortune. And it seems to be construed as a failure to stand up for yourself. Instead of being guided by what your own nature requires, you allow yourself to be guided, as women are presumably thought to be, by the benefits of others. In relation to laws against killing animals, then, to be compassionate is to subordinate one's own nature to those of the animals concerned, and in doing so to become not only bestial, but also feminized. Spinoza clearly sees this form of compassion as disempowering. People who attempt to cross the species boundary by entering into affective exchange with animals kick against the limits of their nature. But this is an aberration that an understanding of species difference can help us overcome. To move towards the kind of perfection and joyfulness that the ethics offers us, we need to recognize that we can't form empowering communities with animals and concentrate instead on creating empowering human communities. Ultimately, the reason for inquiring into the nature of a species and interpreting it as Spinoza does, is to pinpoint its bearing on our own liberation. This is what makes the question worth worrying about and determines the shape of a satisfactory answer. This, I think, is why Spinoza distinguishes species in terms of their affective and social features, rather than in terms of their biological ones. Thank you very much for listening.
All right, thank you so much, Sue. That was absolutely brilliant, and it was, as usual, a pleasure. So I'm gonna open the floor to questions now. We already have one from Kim Young. You can go ahead and mute yourself.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
My name is Kim from Berlin, Germany. And then thank you, Susan James. It was really quite impressive input on the topic of differences of species in Spinoza. I still think of it skeptically because I think the living organisms and their differences are not main concern of Spinoza, but the finding of one general mechanical explanation of affective life and production of every infinitely many singular individualities. And also Spinoza's main concern in ethics is finding a way of becoming common with others, but outside of the general commonality in the alleged biological species, like becoming common with my bicycle, my sunglasses, my laptop, etc., or with other people, not to mention. But maybe I have to study more about this topic. I have 3 questions, it's not too long. I would like to know what you think the difference between the term form and figure in ethics look like. It's forma and figura. Is the affective similarities you mentioned rather related to the figure but less to the form, or rather to the form less to the figure? And the second question is, what is your understanding of a common notion, by the way? Some says it's the idea of the common structure or common architecture of 2 different things. Some says it's same as concept of species. Some says it's about the very actual becoming common with external things, constituting the common ratio of motion and rest. So I want to know about how you think about this common notion in relation to the species differences. And the third question is, you said in page 5, so I quote, the nature of an individual body cannot be constituted by its extentness alone. It must also possess powers that distinguish it from other bodies. And but you referred there the proposition 36 of the chapter 2, but it's about the necessity of inadequate idea. I quote, inadequate and confused ideas follow with the same necessity as adequate, that is clear and distinct ideas. How is this proposition related to the comment that the nature of an individual must also possess power that distinguish it from other bodies? Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. It sounds as though I may have got the wrong reference in the paper. I'll need to check about the last point. But I think I could perhaps talk a little about the question rather than worry too much about, as it were, whether I've cited the right proposition. When I said that the nature of an individual must involve some distinction from other individuals as well, I was talking about Spinoza's, I think I'm talking there about Spinoza's claim that, as well, all individuals have something in common insofar as they can interact. And I'm appealing to the idea that, as it were, all bodies, for example, are extended. That's something that all bodies have in common. And maybe that relates a little back to your second point about common notions. But I'm saying, in order for a body to be an individual body, it has to be different from other bodies in some ways. So that's all I'm saying there, I think, that there's commonality, but also difference in bodies. And that will be kind of a general point, I think, about all individuals in Spinoza's philosophy. I like your first point about your commonality with your bicycle. I think, of course, Spinoza recognizes that there are ways in which you can, as it were, enter into more harmonious relations with all sorts of things in nature. And that indeed, this is one of the ways that we empower ourselves. But towards the end of the ethics, he says, you remember, that there is nothing so useful to a human being as another human being. And if a rational one, then that is the greatest kind of harmony that you can strive for. And what I've been arguing is that, as it were, the harmony that you enter into with human beings is not matched by the harmony that you can enter into with other kinds of animals. I think your bicycle is the same. You can enter into harmony with it, you can use it in various ways, but it doesn't have this potential to interact with you emotionally. So that's the crucial thing about your relationships with other human beings. And Spinoza is presenting that as the most tremendous source of power, more so than the other kinds of power that you can develop. I think, if you don't mind, I'd rather not try to talk about what I understand by a common notion here. I'm not quite sure, as it were, how you think it bears on this argument that I'm developing, but maybe we could email about it or talk about it at some other point.
Thank you so much. So just a point of general order, if we can limit each question, so each person who asks a question only ask one question at a time, because we have a bit of a queue forming, and then if we have time, we can come back to you. So now I have Thomas Mingue.
Hi, thank you. So my name is Thomas. I'm at McGill University. I really enjoy your talk because it goes on a topic I'm really interested in too. And I might just push you a bit on a thing I have kind of a hard time distinguishing. So on the notion of commonality, I totally agree with you that I think it's the basis for interactions, because as Spinoza would say, we need to have something in common with something in order to have any kind of interaction with them. But in your explanation of commonality, you say a likeness. That's where I'm a bit hesitant. And my question is very simple. What do you see as the difference between a likeness or similitude and commonality or agreement in nature? Because it seems to me that in the case of Adam that you pointed out, Adam believed animals were like him, but it doesn't but to have an interaction with them meant that he agreed in nature with them to some extent. So since similitude seems to be grounded in imagination, it seems that we can do those kind of cross species kind of interaction based on a likeness or similitude, but that agreement might not have the same extension or the same scope. So I'm just curious if you could maybe explain a bit what you see as the difference between yeah, similitude or likeness and agreement in nature and commonality. But thanks for the talk. I really enjoyed it a lot and
Yeah,
sparked a lot.
and thank you for the question, because this is something that I probably need to sort of sort out in my own head in more detail. But I think that these notions run surprisingly close together in the ethics. I mean, when Spinoza talks about this as a sort of pattern of interaction, which is based on having commonality in your nature with another thing, he talks about it as sort of imitation, as it's kind of creating similarity, similitude, making yourself like something else. And I think that's a bit of a stretch, but this is a problem that occurs in early modern theories of sympathy quite generally, because there are some cases where, as it were, the similitude is very straightforward. I mean, you know, I feel passion X and you see me feeling passion X and you feel passion X. But those aren't, for the most part, well, so that might do, for example, for Spinoza's examples of love and hate. But it doesn't do clearly for all the imitation of the affects that he's talking about, where very often, as it were, commonality is generate, or rather similitude isn't the point. I mean, commonality seems to exist in your capacity to respond to something. So I'm not quite convinced that, as it were, that these two are distinct things. I think that they very much run together.
All right, thank you. Moving on to Edith.
Hope I'm allowed to also make a quick comment. So let me start with a comment. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
I'll start with a quick comment. It's interesting that Maimonides, when Maimonides talks about the laws of slaughter, they're intended, it's not, the compassion is not towards the animal, it's in order to humanize us towards other human beings. So it does, in other words, it completely turns the misericordia issue into a different kind of issue.
Yeah.
That's a comment.
And I think there's the same argument, if I remember correctly, in Porphyry, that slaughtering animals bestializes us.
Yeah,
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting aspect on this. The other question, when you were talking about the perseverance, the child, the transformation of the child to the adult, one way to take this into account would be to use the difference between in habitu and in actu, that is common to all the way back to the Aristotelian tradition. Any kind of potentia can be pure potency or potentia in habitu on the way to, and then potentia in actu. So it's the ratio may remain the same. Okay.
Yes. I've lost you, I think, Edith. The ratio may remain the same. Did you say? Yeah, that's good. That's good. I mean, I think that I think that's probably right. I'm not trying to say that that the way Spinoza sets it up is necessarily a problem for him. Mm-hmm. I'm more just trying to say is that this emphasis on the stability of a thing is hard to accommodate in some cases. I mean, that he does need this idea of as a sort of potential powers that can unfold in order to make sense of the cases he's discussing.
Yeah,
Does
and
that
that's
make
very
sense to you?
common in the entire Aristotelian tradition.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. I could say much more about that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Now we have Andrew Lopez.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I have two questions, but I'll only focus on one. And I was basically wondering about, so in the paper you mentioned that while concepts like man, horse, and insect are inadequate ideas, but nevertheless they sort of capture something, right, that we can use. When you talk about sort of like, well, species being defined in some sense about like sort of being able to sort of mutually affect each other, one of the things that popped up into my mind is debates in biology and philosophy of biology about like, well, sure, we have a species concept, but you know, which species concept should we use? So what kind of sort of interactions is Spinoza thinking of here? So there's obviously talk here about reproduction, but then there's sort of issues about like, well, is species defined by, you know, what ecological niche it inhabits? Is it defined by a particular kind of lineage in, you know, in a phylogenetic tree? And so this, I was wondering as to whether this kind of has to push it back to maybe attenuating the claim that it captures something, and maybe saying that like, well, it's really just an epistemological claim, but not an ontological one. Should that be more the view?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, yeah, I've worried about this too. So remember that Spinoza thinks that any idea of a species that we come up with is an idea. It's something that, as it were, we create, and so there can be lots of them, and there will be lots of them, depending on people's different interests. After all, you know, he's surrounded by biologists who are differentiating species in completely different ways. What I was trying to suggest is that he is arguing that, as well, what we want this species concept for ultimately is an ethical purpose. That's to say, we want it to help us guide ourselves in learning to live together. And now, as it were, does it capture everything about nature? I think Spinoza's not committed to that view. I mean, there might be quite a lot more to say about the physical things in animals that are the, you know, the other side, in his view, the same, but under a different description of these psychological points that he's emphasizing, if we can put it like that. But I think, I mean, I think his idea is, isn't it, that that the better we reason, the more epistemology tracks ontology, as it were. You know, the more we do pick up the natures of things in the world. And so that there's every reason to think that picking up this view, Spinoza thinks he is successfully picking up something that's true about animal kinds. As well, whether it is or not is a different question.
Thank you.
Right, so I had put myself in the queue, and it so just happens that this could as well work as a finger for this question. So if you don't mind, I'll just go ahead. So what I was wondering is, so the way you have explained the way these boundaries between species are formed, it sounds very bodily as an account, and then it sounds very effective. And I'm just wondering, insofar as we can understand the minds of other living beings, since the mind is just an idea of the body, are we to take it that the reason why I feel a different kind of lust than a horse is because my mind is shaped in a different way from all the interactions I had?
I think I mean, we can say it correlates with the fact that you have a different kind of body from a horse. I mean, we can make that general point as Spinozists, as it were, about any particular thing, and that will be you. Now, you particularly have, yeah, so Spinoza has this problem, doesn't he? I mean, he wants to talk about human affects in general, but he also wants to allow that, of course, human individuals are very different, and that the character of their affects is shaped, exactly as you say, by their bodies and by their histories, and so on. You know, so one person's love is going to be a bit different from another person's love, and so on. But nonetheless, I think the crucial point that I'm trying to draw attention to here, if this works, is that that even within that range of human variation, there is the capacity or the potential to respond to other human beings. There's enough similarity between us to make that possible. Whereas in the case of our relationships with animals, there isn't. This actually seems to me a very dodgy claim. I mean, we can certainly respond to the affective dispositions of animals as we understand them, and arguably sometimes they can respond to ours. So I think there's kind of more going on in this argument than I've totally sort of brought into play here. And there is a kind of real hostility to people who engage with animals. I mean, it's just heading in the wrong direction, because what you should be doing is interacting with humans.
Of course.
Does that answer the question?
Yes, yes, it does. I mean, the usual problem is how can he claim anything should happen? But that's the general problem with him and ethics. So next we have Marie Wood.
Oh, yes. So
Hi, Mary. Hi.
Thank you very much for the talk. And also thanks to Emanuela and everyone who was involved in organizing it. My question is connected to domination. So as we know, and some have argued, Spinoza postulates the appropriateness of human domination over animals and other non-human species. And so what I was wondering after your talk is whether or not we could say that there is domination that might be appropriate, and there's domination that might be not appropriate. And the reason or our metric for distinguishing between two forms of domination could be whether or not they would appreciate difference. So I think what I want to say by this is that domination seems to be appropriate as an exercise of right that is based on reason. Because for Spinoza, the right against other species is grounded in reason, and this domination is in contrast to domination that is based on, for example, of imagination that might take the form of oppression and exploitation. So that would ultimately be counterproductive, as it might destroy our resources. So I'm wondering if with Spinoza, we can make the difference between a kind of reasonable and rational domination and harmful oppression. So dominance or domination that would be reasonable would, for example, like stick to certain limits. And And I think just on another side note, I was wondering if nowadays we might need more womanish narratives that would stop us from eating animals and destroy resources. And as you know, that well, human communities are not only living guided by reason, maybe we need those womanish narratives today more than ever. So
yes, yes, thank you. Yes, I think that Spinoza definitely wants to, or has the possibility of distinguishing between what you call rational domination, where, yeah, there might be lots of examples of that within the human community and between animals and humans, and harmful oppression. But whether there is such a thing as harmful oppression of animals for him will be entirely determined by what's in our human interest, ultimately. So, I mean, if it's in our interest to not oppress animals in certain ways for ecological reasons or whatever, or for, then as well, Spinoza will have to kind of ask himself whether that's rational. And similarly, if it is in our interest to dominate animals or oppress animals for certain reasons, the same. But so I think that's the way that goes. And I'm not committed, I'm not arguing, of course, that, you know, that Spinoza is right about this, but I think that's the way he's dividing up the territory. And as to the more womanish narratives, that's to say, whether it might be kind of rational to put other people's interests on a par with or ahead of your own in the animal case, I mean, I think that's really an important question. It seems to me that's not something that Spinoza can acknowledge, but of course it might be. I mean, from our point of view, seems absolutely right, yes.
Thanks, Sue. So now we have Karen.
Sorry, I had to unmute. my mouse was. So thank you so much for this. I wanted to ask you about, so at the end of your paper, this is starting around page 12, you address two worries that we might have regarding this conception of species that you've presented. And I just wanted to ask you maybe to say a little bit more about this first worry. So you say that a first worry is that maybe Spinoza underestimates the extent of effective interaction between different kinds of animals. And you say that actually we can sort of answer this by saying the species concept can be open enough such that if it turns out that, so you have examples here that it might be the case that given a certain way that our powers might change, maybe it becomes the case that humans and chimpanzees or chimpanzees and cyborgs form a single species. And so on the one hand, I liked that answer to the objection, but on the other hand, it seemed to undermine some of what I think was presented earlier. So one thing that it might potentially undermine is that even though, as you say, his account is not focused on reproduction, you do say that implicitly it seems that Spinoza is committed to the idea that one way of thinking about species is that we reproduce things of the same kind. That it's, even if it's not the focus, it's clear that he does hold something like this. So this account at the end here would undermine that. But maybe more broadly, one thing I really liked about your account was the way that you thought about this idea of limits and limitations. And initially, this is, as you say, it's presented in a kind of physical sense in terms of proportion. But as you discuss, as you develop this account of limit in thinking about growth and development, it seems, and this idea of a complex nature that unfolds, and that seems to I really like that idea of thinking about limitations, that it seems that one thing, at least for Spinoza, that defines species is that there really are naturally defined limits in terms of our powers and how we grow and how we develop. So I just wonder if you're, in trying to answer the objection at the end, whether it kind of undercuts some of the other features of the account of species that you presented Spinoza as having.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, from Spinoza's point of view, then as well, what you say about about reproduction and its role in the story, I think that goes entirely away. I mean, that for him, if this question of the character of your lusts is species specific, then that's important, because that's an important sort of dimension of this affective interaction. Cyborgs, reproduction, I mean, things get very complicated here. And, I suppose for us, there's the opportunity to reconsider these things as we just reconsider reproductive technologies. But so there's a kind of a split there between what Spinoza might think about this and what we might have the opportunity to do with that idea. And I think your question about the limits is absolutely right. And it goes back perhaps to Andrew's question about, what exactly are you capturing here? And there I wanted to say that, Spinoza is trying to capture more than, as it were, just some sort of half-baked idea that you've come up with about what a species is. I think he's trying to capture something about actually what natures there are. And so that seems to go your way too, that there are limits. The reason I was wanting to be, the reason I was sort of feeling a bit quizzical about that really is just that Spinoza seems to be so decided about what the limits of our affective interaction are. And I suppose I feel a bit more open-minded about that. I mean, if you think of something like, Jane Goodall and her chimpanzees, something like that, do you really want to say there's no, as it were, kind of affective interaction that unfolds powers there? So that was, I suppose, what I was worrying about. But you're right. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. So moving on, we have Joe Green.
Okay. So thank you, Sue, for a really interesting paper. And there's so much there to think about. I've almost talked myself out of my original question, but of course, your paper set me to thinking about whether there were places where Spinoza talked about things changing natures. And the only thing I could think of was the case of suicide. And that, of course, doesn't seem to have any meaning for the case of species at all, even though there's this sort of intuitive link between natures and species, I think, simply because of our place in the sort of long Aristotelian tradition about thinking about natural kinds. But I still wonder a little bit about those passages. The one comment about suicide, that someone can assume a different nature without knowing it, that in such a way that will cause them to, I guess, act against the perseverance of the nature that they originally were. And maybe there is another comment, I can't remember where this one occurs, that we can't morph ourselves into something else. But the implication there was that we can perhaps be morphed by something else. Or if we want to become something else, we're being affected by another nature. So maybe these may actually be texts that serve the point in your favor, the epistemology to metaphysics point. But I guess I wonder if you think those passages have any relevance at all, and I should have maybe thought more about my question before I asked it. Okay.
No, not at all. I mean, I think there are passages where Spinoza suggests that our ordinary sense of what, what an individual is and how long it endures and when it changes may be mistaken. Right. I mean, there's the famous passage about the Spanish poet who, who was once a great playwright and now, is just a kind of demented old man or something of that sort. And so, Spinoza does suggest there that, as it were, he's lost one nature and acquired another, and other passages you mention. So I think there is some room for maneuver there. But
well, the reason why I almost withdrew my question is because I thought, well, of course, these are cases where individual essences are individual for Spinoza, and nature is, in some sense, closely linked metaphysically with nature and essence have the close link. So these are simply inapplicable passages. Spinoza is simply talking about something else. But I don't know. I guess that was my question.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I think it. I mean, I think they are important passages. I mean, what those passages suggest, as far as I can see, is that setting aside your suicide case and concentrating just on the Spanish poet to start with, I mean that as well, we take the Spanish poet to be one nature or essence from the beginning to the end. And, maybe we should think of this Spanish poet as a kind of sequence of natures that we've put together. And there are clearly dramatic changes that the Spanish poet can undergo. So I suppose you might say, I hadn't really worked this through. I suppose you might say that opens up the space for Spinoza to say, that a human being can change so radically that they become what? I don't know, an animal anyway, some kind of animal. But there's not much hint in the text that when he talks about change in natures, that's the kind of thing he has in mind.
Yes, yes, thank you. That's very helpful, actually. Yes.
Okay, so we have John Heidemann wanted to ask something about this.
No, it was just a suggestion of another text of this example of species changing nature, which she mentions in the preface to part 5, that somebody had suggested that a hunting dog could be trained, or a house dog could be trained to pursue game, where I guess he's suggesting 2 different breeds of dogs being made to act against their nature. And maybe that's why he seems to treat this example as with some skepticism, because it doesn't fit within his idea of species being in some sense immutable.
Yes, thank you. That's interesting. I mean, after all, he's not suggesting that a dog ceases to be a dog. He's suggesting that, as it were, a dog with one, whose character, whose nature is unfolded in one way, the nature of that dog may continue to unfold in a very different way under certain sorts of external pressures. But I had wondered, of course, about those sorts of cases where, animals can obviously change very dramatically. And I'd also wondered about the interactions between dogs and their trainers, or horses and their trainers, as questions for Spinoza about whether there really can't be mutual effective interaction between species. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's Aesop's tale, right? That he's quoting, and it seems to be right in the spirit of the painting, the itching that you showed us. So I'm trying to find who's the, okay, we have Dallas Jokic.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you so much, Professor James, for this paper and this talk. I really enjoyed it and found a lot that was very exciting about it. I share some of your concerns about Spinoza's tendency to underestimate the extent of effective interaction between species. And it made me wonder about whether this connects to some of the other questions, but like the usefulness of the concept of species in general, and whether it might often kind of like lead us astray. It seems to me that it probably leads Spinoza astray to make this underestimation, and whether we might be better served just turning to the concept of essences. First, on the grounds that we can kind of like get at the more specific individual context of one individual and what types of interactions and agreements are going to most increase their powers. The Jane Goodall example is a good one, but I think we can think of lots. And the second,
which example?
The Jane Goodall example that you gave.
Yeah.
And the second kind of case I'm thinking about is like if we think of individuals in a broader sense than just like me and you, but think of things like communities or political organizations or ecosystems or something like that, where we might be able to have concepts of mutual advantage by, expanding and shrinking concepts of essences based on different types of proportions or different types of causal power. So I was just wondering if there might be some ways in which species might kind of act as a concept in a superstitious way that gets us away from the actual types of interactions that most increase our power.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, obviously, Spinoza's ontology is fundamentally, I think, an ontology of individuals. And then it's a question as to what other kinds, what kinds of composite individuals there are, and whether communities and ecosystems satisfy the criteria. And that would be kind of a long conversation. I mean, as to whether species kind of gets us away from the things that we ought to be concentrating on, that I'm not so sure about, because I mean, it does seem to me that Spinoza is at least very concerned about the boundary between humans and other animals. He may not be, I mean, he doesn't seem to be, and he may have no reason to be so very interested in the difference between, what he would call lower species. But is it superstitious? Is it just kind of, as Spinoza would say, mixing up, reversing what's good and what's bad to worry about species? Then it seems to me that there's textual evidence that that's not what he thinks, at least not all the time, because it is a big worry for him to understand, if you want to be an empowered and rational human being, you really do need to understand as well what the boundary between around your species is, because that has direct consequences for what you do.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question before we hit the half hour. We have Dimitris Vartoulakis. You are still muted.
Sorry, rookie mistake. Yes, I realized I started speaking before and muting myself. Hello, Sue. Thanks for the paper. That was really stimulating. I'd just like to ask something from the very, very beginning of your presentation, namely, about the questions that you posed. And I'm really not sure what is at stake in the questions that you're asking in relation to Spinoza. Like the way you frame the questions kind of puts Spinoza in such a kind of Aristotelian framework, all the sort of typology stuff, or, like I was sort of, struggling to understand what is really at stake in asking the questions that you asked in relation to Spinoza's text. Are you ultimately wanting to present Spinoza as an Aristotelian? Or, I mean, are these, I'm not even sure whether the epistemological aspect was the important aspect in your questions. So it's not, I'm not really asking a question. I've just been grappling into understanding what is the ultimate aim of asking the questions that you asked? It just wasn't very clear to me. That's all. It's a clarification more than a question.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that's a very good question about the questions. I pose these questions because I think that these are questions by which Spinoza is surrounded. And there are often cases in Spinoza's work, I think, where he is kind of addressing the intellectual questions that surround him, but not overtly. I mean, you know, he's doing his own thing, but in the process, he's kind of saying, and by the way, this is what I think about this. And so these three questions were an attempt to kind of formulate some of the questions about species that are around and which seem to be the ones that he is implicitly dealing with. And I also hope to show by, as it was sort of contextualizing Spinoza in that way, how he is departing from many of the traditional answers given to these questions, although that wasn't something that I spelled out at all in this talk, and offering this view, which seems to me, as far as I can tell, you know, quite a distinctive account of what's important about these questions. So you could say, you know, on the whole, people are interested in species for kind of biological or natural scientific reasons in the 17th century. That seems to be why they get off on it, as it were, and what's at stake for them. And Spinoza is interested in it, I'm suggesting, really for ethical reasons in the end. The question is, you know, why do you want to know about species? Well, not for these reasons that you're offering, but for the reasons that I'm going to show you. And if you ask the question that way, as it were, why does a concern with species matter to us? Then not only will you be asking a different question, but you'll give a different answer, as it were. It will shape a different account of what species are and what the boundary is.
So if I understood what you're saying correctly, it's more a matter of presenting a series of questions that point to the milieu or the context within which Spinoza is working, and to which Spinoza has to sort of respond in a way, but which are not Spinoza's questions as such, or important questions of Spinoza.
Some of them are his questions, because I think he does answer them. No, he takes these questions on, and it's important for him to show that there's, it's important for him that there's no metamorphosis, because that's an important consequence of his metaphysics. And it's important for him to give the account of species difference and differentiation that he does. But it's important not for the reasons that most of his contemporaries have in being interested in. I mean, look, you know, he's not like Schwammerdam or someone, you know, who's trying to say, you know, kind of exactly what's the difference between this kind of lice and that kind of ant or whatever. Yeah, so that was the plan.
Thank you so much. I think we could have time for one last question. Kim, do you think you can ask it in a minute? Kim?
Oh yeah, thank you. It was just for some entertaining, like Charles said, could we think that there is also in ethics a certain kind of teaching strategy of using both esoteric and exoteric level of explanation, like in theological political treatise, and that the very few biological I think you can deny it, but I think it's very few biological arguments belong to the exoteric level, because he's surrounded of his contemporaries were very interested in the biological topics, because it still seems very hard to reconcile his mechanical materialist thoughts, as well as the strict nominalist rejection of general concepts like human, stone, and horse, with the distinctions among species. Couldn't they be a MacGuffin for Spinoza's own reasoning and to convincing the readers? I mean, the distinction among the species.
Well, I mean, I agree, and we've said several times that the distinctions among species are not as a sort of ontologically fundamental.
Mm.
But when we reason according to Spinoza, I mean, we need to use a lot of collective terms, like we need the notion of a human being, for instance, for the ethics to get very far. And so it seems to me that, I mean, the inadequate ideas that we form by forming collections of things are nonetheless ideas about which we can reason. And that what Spinoza is doing is saying, well, okay, we've got these ideas of species. I mean, we can form the ideas of the difference between the lion and the tortoise. Okay, so now let's start reasoning with them, and maybe they'll hold up, or maybe they won't. And the reasoning here is that kind of in-between sort, where we're not working with entirely adequate ideas, but we're working with ideas that have sort of some degree of adequacy to them. And we're trying to, you know, firm them up into bodies of ideas and argument in which we can have more confidence. And so, as I see it, this account of the relationship between species is part of that process.
Okay, so that was wonderful, and that sounds like a great time to thank our speaker once more. Thanks, Sue, for this wonderful paper and a great discussion. So I think this was the best inaugural meeting that we could all hope for. And so I will see you in the spring. We will start mid-January. Please follow us on Facebook. And if you are not yet on the mailing list, please contact us. I suspect that if you got us here, you have our emails. So I wish you happy holidays, and thanks once more to Sue and to everybody for showing up.
All of you for such a wonderful discussion. I'm really grateful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Indeed, lovely to see you.
And we call the deadline for submissions. So please submit your proposals to us. Okay, see you in the spring.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you for that wonderful
Thank
paper.
you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.